that on all sides, CARICOM member states are buffeted by economic forces with which they cannot contend alone, and against which they now lack a strong and empowered single regional capacity to fight together. Among the unfavorable conditions with which they contend are World Trade Organization rules that treat these small states exactly the same as they treat the United States, Canada, India, and Brazil, giving them no special and differential treatment despite their smallness and vulnerabilities. Another challenge is that these countries have all been graduated in the international community. That's a wonderful word, graduated, from access to concessional financing. In other words, they won't get it. Deteriorating economic conditions in CARICOM, including the high debt about which I just spoke, and poor credit ratings, worsening terms of trade for goods, and urgently now, as we speak, the withdrawal from Caribbean banks of correspondent banking relations by banks primarily in the United States, an action that has already had high cost effects on trade, including tourism. The latter point is worth an address on its own, but suffice for me to say here that the problem, euphemistically called de-risking, is real and requires unrelenting action by CARICOM governments and the private sector, including the tourism sector, which needs local banks to have correspondent relations in order to transact business and especially to collect your tourism receipts. This is not somebody else's problem. It is also yours. And you better take it on board because it's real. Incidentally, our region of the world is now described by the United States and certain countries of the European Union as a high-risk area for financial services. We're also accused of being tax havens. But the reality is that in not one of the CARICOM countries do we have secrecy legislation. In fact, quite the opposite. Our legislation is geared for sharing information immediately upon request by any other country. But here's a remarkable thing that happened today. The European Union Parliament decided that they would expose the biggest tax haven in the world. Today, the country they want to expose, the great United States of America. And why? Because there are 4 states in the United States that are the biggest secrecy locations in the world. Wyoming, Delaware, South Dakota, and Nevada. And those are the facts of life. We are not secrecy destinations. We are not tax havens. That's where the tax haven is. But we are small, and we can be bullied unless together we resist it. And if any country believes it can do it on its own, forget it. This is a battle that I am now engaged in Washington, a battle that I tell you that I'm happy to be engaged in, because if it is one thing that I will not do in my life, maybe when I'm dead and gone, but not now, is I will not sit by and watch these countries be taken advantage of by anybody. And as long as I have breath in my body, my voice will be heard. Then there is climate change, which poses a clear danger to the survival of many Caribbean countries, including this one. If global warming is not contained to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the coastal areas of many Caribbean countries will be severely eroded by sea level rise. And if that happens, guess whose businesses are going to go first? Yours. All those hotels that are now resting on beaches. Now, at the Paris Climate Change Conference last December, Caribbean environment ministers fought valiantly for the objective of keeping rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and trying to get money for mitigation and adaptation. If they had not fought as valiantly as they did, the situation in which we now are in would have been much worse. But we have an agreement that provides no legally binding commitment to limit the average global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, the climate change action plans that have been submitted by 188 countries would lead to a temperature rise as high as 2.7 degrees Celsius. At that point, there are parts of St. Lucia that will not be here. Also not in that agreement is a legally binding commitment to provide developing countries with the funds needed to adapt and mitigate against the effects of climate change. As for money, for mitigation and adaptation, here are some facts that you should know. The Green Climate Fund allocates 25% of its financing for adaptation activities in small island states, less developed countries, and African states. But as of November last year, only $35.7 billion was pledged, and of that, only a mere 52% deposited. For that huge area, that's all that's happened. Even more distressing, of what has actually been deposited, only 14.3 billion has been approved for projects. And of that sum, a paltry 1%, or 700 million, has so far been approved for projects in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. All of Latin America, $700 billion. The Caribbean is at the very bottom, and its share would be inadequate for financing its needs. Yet, while the Caribbean is among the greatest victims, it is the least of the polluters leading to global warming and climate change. The unfairness is palpable. The cause for justice is compelling. Now, these are all legitimate questions for all of you to consider. They are real, they affect your business, and there's every good reason, therefore, for you to raise your voices locally, regionally, and internationally against global warming and for a better deal for the Caribbean. Now, amidst all these troubles, greater demands are made on the tourism sector throughout CARICOM to deliver employment, revenues, and foreign exchange, as well as a competitive product. Indeed, tourism on average now accounts for a significant percentage of the gross domestic product of CARICOM countries taken as a whole. All that I have just described is the context in which tourism is functioning. Clearly, there's an urgency for CARICOM countries as a whole to address their fragile condition and to recognize that while national initiatives are imperative for economic growth and development, and they must be pursued diligently, deeper regional collaboration, including economic integration, also holds beneficial and sustainable solutions. Therefore, the reinvigoration of CARICOM has all the urgency of now. Continuing to neglect it and only to pay lip service to it in ritualistic meetings and wordy press conferences, that was wordy press conferences, not worthy, will hasten the process of decline and adversely impact every sector of the economies, including tourism. Now, toward the end of this presentation, I'll return to the issue of what might be done to reinvigorate CARICOM as a crucial player in the affairs of each and all of its member states. But now I'd like to turn to specific concerns in the tourism industry. I'm doing this as much to underscore the real challenges with which all CARICOM states are faced, as much as to sound a warning to you about the survival of your industry. Let me first acknowledge that despite all those who often dismiss tourism as too fragile to be a player in the economic development of the Caribbean, the industry has emerged as a strong and resilient economic activity that has become a fundamental contributor to global economic recovery by generating billions of dollars in exports and creating millions of jobs. It has played the same role in many CARICOM countries, including, as I pointed out earlier, St. Lucia. The UN World Tourism Barometer has reported that tourism receipts increased by $48 billion in 2014 to reach a record of $1.2 trillion globally. And an additional $221 billion was generated from international passenger transport, bringing the total export earnings from international tourism to $1.5 trillion. That is not money to be sneezed at. Now here's the thing. Remarkably, the Americas was the highest growth area for tourism in the world. But the lion's share of the receipts, $210 billion of it, went to North America. The second highest share was earned by the Caribbean. But here's the North American number, $210 billion. The Caribbean's was $27 billion. You see the gap. Still, the Caribbean was ahead of all of South America and ahead of all of Central America. Now that's quite an accomplishment for a little region like this. And the people who deserve the commendation are you, the people who are actually doing it. But, and here's the rub, as Shakespeare would say, the biggest beneficiaries in the Caribbean area were the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Between them, they accounted for almost half of that $27 billion, between the three of them. The others scrambled with the remaining 50%. Now let's remember the three lead countries, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. 9 years ago, I wrote a commentary that was widely published, including here in St. Lucia. It was entitled The Big Three and Little CARICOM. This is what I said in that commentary. By any objective analysis, the US embargo of Cuba will be lifted within the next decade. US companies want a significant piece of the Cuban action, which they now see going to European and Canadian companies and increasingly to China and Russia. When the embargo is lifted, the Caribbean will be a very different place. Remember, I was writing this 9 years ago. Obama had not yet made a statement. The Caribbean, as I said then, would be one in which two of the largest countries with populations of 20 million people would be Spanish-speaking, and of far greater importance to the global community than the little countries of CARICOM. Who will bother with a market of 6 million if they've got a market of 20? It is only the US trade embargo against Cuba that now prevents an integrated relationship between Cuba, the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean that would dwarf CARICOM. Now, I went on to say, CARICOM governments would do well to bolster their economies and their capacity for dealing with their Caribbean neighbors and the international community by urgently completing the arrangements for implementing their own Caribbean single market. And I urged that CARICOM member states should also swiftly reform the governance of CARICOM, which seriously needs overhaul. That deeper economic relationship between the Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries is now coming to pass as we speak, threatening to leave CARICOM behind. 2 weeks ago, my friend, colleague, and fellow analyst of Caribbean affairs, David Jessup, pointed out that work is progressing on studies on the creation of a new Caribbean economic bloc that might bring together Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, with the objective of utilizing the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and capitalizing on new trade opportunities. He quoted Carlos Rivera Velez, the president of the Puerto Rico Association of Industries, as saying this: "We hope that in the not too distant future, we can see the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba working together as a productive economic bloc for each of our countries and to strengthen our region." Jessup observed that these developments are taking place as CARICOM has become less coherent, where dysfunction and strife now mitigates against the spirit of the Caribbean integration movement. And he concluded in terms very similar to my own statement 9 years ago by saying this: "It is time for the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole to develop new thinking about how best to incorporate a future open trade relationship with Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico in ways that deepen in the longer term trade with neighbors in Central and South America. It is time," he said, "to read the writing on the wall." Now, clearly there is a need for a response from CARICOM countries collectively to the economic cooperation process that is being launched with vigor in its own front yard. Or they will fulfill the fears that led to the creation of the West Indian Commission in 1990,